Welcome to Watershed Chats, presented by the Waterpeople podcast in collaboration with Patagonia. Watershed moments are traditionally understood as a division or distinction between two phases. They can be turning points that define our shared history. Here, we sit down with experts and those in service of solutions for a healthier and habitable future on planet Ocean. Our podcast comes to you from the coastal land and waters of both the Bundjalung and Kabi Kabi nations. We'd like to acknowledge these traditional custodians and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We'd also like to extend that respect to all First Nations people this podcast ripples out toward. LEAH Thomas is an explorer of the relationship between social and environmental justice. She graduated from Chapman University in 2017 and is currently at the leading edge of intersectional environmentalism, a term she coined as an inclusive version of environmentalism that advocates for the protection of both people and the planet simultaneously. Intersectional environmentalism builds upon the environmental justice and eco-feminist movements by focusing on marginalized communities who bear disproportionate impacts from environmental crises ranging from toxic waste to water pollution to climate change and more. After posting a simple but powerful graphic and pledge on Instagram, LEAH's unifying ideas went viral amidst the rising tide of the Black Lives Matter movement and the irrefutable discriminations against Brown and Black Americans. Her work was scooped up and supported by organizations as disparate as the Sierra Club, BuzzFeed, and Vogue. As we're recording amidst social distancing, we caught up with LEAH over the net, so please excuse any dropouts or glitchy moments and enjoy hearing from writer and activist LEAH Thomas. I just wanted to say thank you for the powerful message you're putting out into the world right now.
I really appreciate that, and thank you so much for connecting and being willing to talk about these things. I know it's not always super easy, but it's so important. So I really appreciate you having me come on and then just seeing that you're personally interested in these things. It's really, really, really amazing.
Thank you. Well, I'd love to know how you found your way to intersectional environmentalism and the work of environmental justice.
Yeah, so my way to environmental justice, it was kind of backwards. I found social justice first and then realized that I really liked environmental science. And then I started to kind of see some of the connections between both of those things. But I went to school in Southern California, initially was studying biology, but I just found myself gravitating towards the classes where I could talk about ecosystems ecology because I just loved seeing how ecosystems operated, and that felt really interesting to me, not so much the chemistry. So I went home for summer break, and I was going to change my major to communications, but my mom's very traditional and wanted me to be a scientist and wanted me to do a science degree. So I told her, look at this science I found. It seems really cool. It's environmental science. And I changed my major to environmental science and policy, got ready to go back to California because I'm from St. Louis. And unfortunately, right before I went back, there was an officer involved police shooting of an unarmed Black teenager. And it happened about 10 minutes away from my house. And it was really scary, really traumatizing. And to see my city literally catch on fire and during that time was just really hard to process. And then 2 weeks later, I needed to go back to school and start my environmental science classes. So when I was in my classes, I really couldn't separate my Black identity from the information I was taking in about climate change and environmentalism because I was in California and I could find so much healing at the beach, in the mountains, the fresh air. And I felt like just so guilty because my friends and family were back home fighting for my civil rights and in some cases inhaling tear gas when I was inhaling clean air. So when I was learning about the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, I was just reading so much data about how Black and Brown communities also don't have the same access to clean air and what I consider to be a basic right. So that just made me really zero in on environmental justice and start to think about what I wanted my environmentalism to be. And I wanted it to be something that considered my identity and didn't push it to the side, but actually brought it to the forefront and brought the voices of the people who are impacted the most by environmental injustices to the front to allow them to lead the way, because I just believe that environmentalism and social justice are so interconnected, and the same systems that degrade and oppress the environment are the same systems that unfortunately degrade and oppress people.
That's so beautifully put. Thank you. Yeah, for me, the intertwining of social and environmental, see it very similarly to the way you do. And when I sit with it, I feel like, how will we ever treat the planet better than we treat ourselves? And how will we ever treat the planet better than we treat each other? I don't know if we can have a harmonious existence ecosystemically if we can't work it out in our own homes and in our own minds first.
I agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah, and that's where I came. Like you, I studied environmental science and was also pursuing a social science degree at the same time. And like you, the connections were irrefutable. Seeing the way that I was focusing at that time more on feminism and ecofeminism, and I'd love to talk through the details of some of that with you and how you're blooming those ideas even more beautifully than they have been in the past. But yeah, what was so salient for me was the fact that there was this link in the way white Western culture has tended to encourage an ethic of domination and oppression and separation from each other, from the planet, and has pillaged with this ethic of divide and conquer. Were you finding similar ideas, and have you been seeing the unfurlings of those ideas in your personal life as you've graduated and started working in the outdoor community, especially?
Yeah, I just found it so strange that we wouldn't listen to people who have historically had better relationships to the land, like, and culturally. So a lot of indigenous communities, I think, probably largely inspired what the environmental movement is today. And I think there's so much to learn from other cultures, but in a different way than it's been done before in the environmental movement, because I feel like sometimes people will extract indigenous wisdom, or particularly go to Eastern religions and look at Buddhism and Hinduism, and they will extract certain principles, but then the people who are at the forefront aren't necessarily those people. So I think just to take it one step further is to learn from people who have culturally had better relationships with the land, that aren't all about just dominating it, and allow them to come to the forefront and be able to lead the way, because we've allowed certain people to lead the way. So maybe we can be more collaborative and see what we can learn from people who have incredible wisdom when it comes to being interconnected with the land.
Yeah. What's your approach? How can we celebrate without co opting cultures?
It can be a little difficult sometimes. So I was a comparative world religions minor. So similar to you, like, I feel like while we were studying environmental science, we also were looking at that kind of social component. And I grew up with a grandma who was Buddhist, which was really awesome. And I'm just really fascinated by different religions. And I've had different points in my life where I think I've done it the wrong way. And maybe I would extract something from Hinduism that I thought was really cool and then put my own spin on it a little bit, but not necessarily deeply study that religion to be able to do my practices with justice. But I think one thing to do is, whenever there's a community that has historically been marginalized that you would like to learn from, to or you would like to help, when you enter into that space and when you talk to people within that community, don't tell them what you think they need. Ask them what they need and then try to support that work. and then also listen first before you decide to educate on their behalf, and try to instead amplify their messaging so you can be a supporter of their messaging, but not necessarily the person who is taking that messaging and going forward. Um, if that helps. I just think as much as possible, Black and Brown voices should just be amplified and brought to the forefront. And if we could do a better job at identifying who those people are already in those communities that are making incredible change and put our resources behind them to uplift their messaging a little bit. But it can be difficult because sometimes culture is just so intertwined in society, especially in the United States, which is really multicultural and is really great, but just remembering where maybe you got that information from and making sure to be respectful and, yeah, to those different cultures.
Mm. The conversation around race and racism in the US right now feels really familiar to where feminism was in the 1960s and 1970s when women were gathering in consciousness raising circles and in the streets together to protest the marginalization of women's work, the pay gap, and so much more. Albeit second wave feminism was mostly middle class, hetero, and white women, but there are also pioneering lesbian feminists and intersectional Black feminists like Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, and Alice Walker. But when I read the history books and I look back, I just hear them saying, listen to our stories sincerely. Try to understand how our lives and experiences have been marginalized. And so many people, men and women, came out and still do, saying, no, it shouldn't be called feminism. That's not the right way to do it. If you want equality, then it should be called humanism or egalitarianism, because feminism is inherently exclusive. But what so many women were saying was, let's acknowledge and honor femininity now. Let's look at the particular ways that gender has disadvantaged us so we can swing the pendulum away from the patriarchal and move toward egalitarianism. And I'm hearing such similar sentiments now in the way some people are using the phrase all lives matter, which is just a blatant denial of the pain, the suffering, and trauma that's living within our culture in so many of our bodies. For those of us who don't have Black or brown skin or who haven't yet pulled focus on the particulate matter of racial biases built into our systems, now's the time to listen humbly.
Exactly. And just, I don't believe when people say you can completely transcend your ego. Like, we're human, we all have egos. And I think it's important just to keep them in check. And when you start feeling defensive when someone says Black Lives Matter, or, listen to women and value and cherish us, and your response to that is something that's dismissive, or it needs to include you in order for you to support it, I think people should really take a step back, kind of meditate on that, and see what their intentions are behind those sorts of responses. Because a lot of times it seems like a need to be included. And the need to be included sometimes is coming from people who have always been included. And I just want to challenge those people to say, like, okay, you're getting a small glimpse of what it feels like to maybe not be heard in this moment, but maybe don't personalize it so much, and better yet, just uplift the voices of the people who want to be heard instead. And because I know I can't be included in every movement. If there's something that's, I mean, I can be included, but it might not be impacting me. If there's another POC community that's suffering, so another issue would be, say, Indigenous rights in the United States and not having access to the best drinking water or educational system. I'm not going to go into that community and say, well, I mean, what about Black people? And I do advocate for that personally in my own life. But my first priority is to make people feel heard and listened to so I can truly support them. And I can use my experiences to empathize with them, but I don't need to dominate that space with me when it's about other people. And I feel like the more we can just listen to other people and their particular issues and not always feel like we have to make it about us, it'll be a lot easier to just find unity and support other people and uplift their messaging. And they'll be there for us when we're going through a fight. Maybe that's impacting our particular culture, and then there'll be more unity. I hope. That's what I think.
I'd love to ask you about the graphic you created, Environmentalists for Black Lives Matter. What led you to creating that graphic? It's been incredible to see it pop up all over social media, all over the internet, seen by millions of people now. You couldn't have known that it would catch on so wildly, could you have?
No, it's so surreal. I mean, honestly, it was a hard time. I was furloughed from my position at the time at the company that I was working for, and I was figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. And the pandemic was happening, is happening. And then I was seeing all these videos of just Black trauma and death, and there was just too much heaviness. And I remember that day, I just had a moment, and it was really a calm moment of clarity where I got up in my bed. So I didn't even get out of bed, and my laptop was at the end of my bed. And I sat there with my covers, and I have no graphic design experience. So I just got on Canva, that website where you can quickly make graphics. And I Googled Environmentalist for Black Lives Matter just to make sure that I wasn't taking anyone's idea or work. And I had seen similar graphics that were like teachers for Black Lives Matter and things like that. So I just wrote Environmentalist for Black Lives Matter because that's what I wanted my community to see it. And then I just wanted to repeat it over and over again because my soul just felt like screaming it from the rooftops. So that's why it's repeated so many times in different colors, because that's what I feel like my soul was screaming in that moment. And then the next two slides, I wanted to provide a definition for what my environmentalism was and offer that definition to other people in the environmental community if they wanted to consider themselves to be intersectional environmentalists. And then last, I felt like there needed to be some kind of call to action, and there needed to be steps so people could be intersectional environmentalists instead of me just saying, this is what I do. Okay, bye. So I wanted to have a graphic that people could resonate with and for it to be specifically directed to the environmental community. And I wanted to give them a resource and definitions so they could take steps to create change in the environmental movement. And I honestly didn't expect many people to see it. If anything, I thought people would unfollow me, and it was the exact opposite. And that actually makes me very, very happy with the environmental community. And it's given me so much hope and so much joy to see that other people maybe were thinking something similar, but they just needed the language to be able to move forward and to feel like, oh, I can be a part of this. This is an environmental issue. And that to me has just filled me with so much joy in a time of so much pain, just seeing how excited the environmental community was to finally stand up for Black and Brown lives.
Mm. Yeah, I feel like the conversation around intersectional environmentalism and specifically around racism and how imperative it is to the conversation of environmentalism is so concrete. There's data and there are hard numbers that show that Black and Brown communities are disproportionately affected by dirty air, dirty water, Superfund sites. Can you talk us through some of the numbers and the data for people who are left wondering, like, is this just an intellectual grappling?
Yeah, just in the United States, I can try to get some numbers off the top of my head, but Black and Brown communities are, I think it's 1.58 times, so almost 2 times as likely to experience higher rates of particulate matter in the air. So, like you said, dirty air, and to live in those areas. And I don't have the specific numbers when it comes to the percentage of how more Black and Brown communities are usually live closer to toxic waste sites and Superfund sites like you were talking about. But the data is there, and that was just one that I had off the top of my head because I just wrote an article about it. But by many criteria, so it's not just the air, it's also water, and it's also access to green space. So when I was an environmental science student, I did a GIS project, which is like a mapping project, where the goal of the project was to see how access to green spaces, and I quantified that as like parks, so large parks where people could go to, how that varied depending on the racial demographics of an area. And I chose Southern California and a couple other states in the United States. And I found overwhelming data just from that simple study to see that people of color have less access to green spaces. And I quantified green spaces as being slightly larger than like a park or a playground. And that honestly broke my heart because there's so many people that have to go so far and might not have transportation or access to be able to get there to be able to experience some of the healing properties of nature. And I think that's a pillar of good mental health, like being able to have clean air, clean water, and access to experience the environment. So, how can you have a chance really when you can't even have a safe environment? So those are just some things that I found that made me really want to dive into intersectional environmentalism, because if people can't breathe because they're being assaulted by the police, and they can't breathe because their air quality is terrible, this is a life or death issue, and it needs to be addressed.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love for you to talk us through what doing intersectional environmentalism looks like. How do we enact these ideas?
Yeah, one of the best things about language and being a communications person, it's so cool that people are adopting a definition that I created, which is really, really cool. So it makes sense that people are looking to me for guidance to be able to give them further action steps to practice this philosophy. And I would say, and I've said this before, one of the most important things is to amplify the voices of those who are unheard. So, whether that's a community that has water that's been polluted by fracking fluid, or whether that's a community that doesn't have access to clean air, or a community that lives in a food desert, to really amplify the voices of the leaders in that community and put your support by them. And I'm saying that because my following increased, like I said, from around 10 or 13,000 to around 80,000 in a matter of a week. So I think people are hungry for finding people to support. And then take that one step further by putting your money behind them if you can, showing up at their protests or events, and doing different things to spread awareness about the messages that they're sharing. And also to do your best just to be an ally to those communities and talk to other people who might not be in the majority about some of the things that you're finding, about some of the data, about how Black and Brown people are disproportionately exposed to pollution, and bring that up in your environmental science classes, because I sure wish that that was happening more in my classes. Because when I was the only person really bringing it up, and a couple more really amazing people, it was easier to just shut that down and say, oh, this has nothing to do with environmentalism. But if people are intersectional environmentalists, they can bring that up and challenge their professors in a passionate and compassionate way, and to ask that those things be brought to the table. And I think if students go into their environmental science program understanding intersectionality, they can demand more from the institutions that are teaching them, and they can demand more in their curriculum. And if we all get together and do that, I think real change will happen, and the way environmental science is taught will be different and will be intersectional.
Mm. This is the Water People podcast. So obviously, we concern ourselves with all things water. And part of this conversation, a huge part of it for me, has to do with access. I was looking at some of the numbers. Around 60% of African American children can't swim, compared to 30% of white children. And this, for me, is the real legacy of stolen cultures of discrimination and blocked access to the ocean, to pools, to lakes, to green spaces, as as you highlighted in your study. Surfing culture in particular has been very white, very masculine, and very white in the past. And I don't know if you've had much experience on the topic of the whiteness of aquatic culture, but I know you have a lot of
Yeah.
experience around the whiteness of outdoor culture. And so I just wanted to dive into that a little bit.
Yeah, I worked at a very surf heavy brand previously, and they were trying very hard they just didn't understand why, why there weren't a whole lot of Black surfers, all that. And I remember having a conversation where I tried to bring up the generational trauma that a lot of African Americans have when it comes to water, being stolen from their native land, shipped, stacked body by body in a boat where several people died, being shipped to a new land and then being enslaved. And then, even when they have their freedom, not having access to swimming pools usually. So there's a lot of generational trauma when it comes to water and water access. And I could see why people might feel uneasy in waters because there is that generational trauma. And I remember my dad, who's African American, was a lifeguard, and he put me in the water when I was so tiny, and that was something that my family, and looking back on it, I'm so grateful for that, but they were like, "You will swim. You will get in the water and you will experience the healing properties of water and you will know how to swim." And I didn't realize how big of a deal that was until I realized the data. I think it's like above 60% of African Americans, or hopefully it's decreased, and that would be really amazing. But yeah, I mean, you have to get down to those generational things. And I think environmental organizations or surfing organizations that want to help that can start young, start offering classes for people to learn how to swim, start supporting organizations that are doing that. And that, I think, will change the demographics of certain water sports and activities because it's so fun being in the water. I love it so much, and it is the most healing thing ever. And I think if we address the root cause instead of looking at the problem, then things can change. Because when you address it as a marketer and say, well, we need to find more people of color for these surf pictures for our catalog, versus saying, how can we inspire and do our work as a brand to inspire more people of color to feel safe and have a better connection to the environment? Those are two very different questions and approaches. And I hope more brands will take the approach of education and solving the root cause.
Mm. In your mind, do you feel like these categories for dividing us, racism, sexism, do you think they're symptoms of an even broader unwellness, sickness of our culture?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with that. I think, and it also, I think, connects to our relationship historically with our connection to the land. And like you said earlier, the thought that we need to conquer things and have dominion over things. And I think that language has been so deeply embedded into our current society that our society has become oppressive. And I think people are starting to wake up. There have been various movements and there's been various amounts of people that support different things that are rising up against this oppressive system. And I think it is all interconnected. And I think there's a deep sickness in society, greed and things like that, that are encouraging people to oppress others and see others as beneath them. And I don't know what the cure is. Maybe compassion and people being slightly more empathetic. But I think corporate greed is just so strong and it leads to the oppression of other people.
Yeah, that touches on a really important point for me, which is economics and the way our economic system tells us a story about our nature being inherently competitive. But it's our economic system that's based on ethics of scarcity instead of abundance.
Yes,
And that drives us to further divide and feel separate from our neighbors and from our communities. And I feel like it's the economic system that, if we can reform that, then I think we can get to the heart of a lot of the social issues that have to be unraveled as well.
I agree. And I think that's such a great point of just seeing how all of this is interconnected, because a lot of people will say, oh, well, I just like to focus on economics and I don't feel like race or gender have anything to do with it. And then some people say, oh, I just want to focus on gender. And, I don't know if like race has much to do with it. And I'm here to say, you know what? I think those things all are very interconnected and we can fight against that sickness, like that you were talking about, altogether, because those things are so interconnected. And it's not by chance that, say, if you think of different intersections, so if there's a low income woman of color, all of those different things will play a part in their experience in the world and how the world treats them. And I think we don't need to separate all of those different things and address them separately if we could instead just address all of those things at once.
Yeah, it's a complicated conversation. So, how are you moving forward with intersectional environmentalism?
I think I mentioned this earlier, but I got the term intersectional from intersectional feminism, and we kind of talked about ecofeminism. Essentially, it is intersectional ecofeminism because I feel like ecofeminism sometimes doesn't have that racial component at the forefront, but essentially those terms are very similar. And in the future, for me personally, I would just really hope to dedicate my life to this cause. I'm working on building an intersectional environmentalist platform with a lot of other amazing environmental activists. And we're going to have resources on how people can be better allies to Black and Brown communities. And we're going to have different issue areas and connect them back to intersectionality. So we're going to have, just to preview it, we're going to launch with 5 or 6. There's going to be LGBTQ plus issues. We're going to talk about food justice. We're going to talk about oceans and waterways. And if someone like the listeners of this podcast are really, really interested in oceans and waterways, they can click into that and they can find resources. They can find personal essays and stories from scientists that are maybe from a background of color that talk about their personal experience and their relationship to the water. They can find organizations that we've deemed to be intersectional that really do cater to Black and Brown communities, and they can find them on the website and find ways on how to support them. And they can find literature and they can find peer-reviewed articles and documentaries and art that are all related to that issue area in the lens of intersectionality. So I'm really excited about this platform and to see where it's going to go. It's really scrappy. There's just a few of us that are putting it together, but we really just want to create a place where people who want to be intersectional environmentalists can go to and find all the different areas that are connected to intersectionality. So it's something that we're still working on, but I'm very excited. And personally, I'll just be maybe working on a book and just trying to do my best to provide more resources, because I feel like creating a term or a philosophy comes with, the responsibility to further educate people. And that's what I would love to do.
So anything else? I feel like you've probably been asked these same questions hundreds of times. Is there anything that people haven't been asking you that you've had on your mind or your heart to talk about?
People have been asking a lot of really great questions that really fill my heart with a lot of joy, but I think not for me particularly, because you're so kind and you were asking me how I was doing. But I think to just check in on your POC friends out there in the world, to everyone who's listening, and try to talk to them and meet them where they're at and check in on how they're doing, because sometimes people will ask me to dive into intersectional environmentalism and my story, which is somewhat traumatic, like with the police officer involved shooting. And before that, I love when people just check in human to human and say, how are you doing? And yeah, I really appreciate that. So that really isn't much of an answer, but just a call to action for people listening to make sure that you check in on your friends. We're human, we're still going through it. So check in on them first and give them a lot of love and care, and then see if they're open to talking about some of these things.
This episode of Watershed Chats is presented by Patagonia, whose purpose-driven mission is to use business to protect our home planet. Thanks to our sound engineer and musician, Shannon Soul Carroll, and artist in residence, Chris Miyashiro. On behalf of myself, Lauren Hill, and my co-host, Dave Rastovich, thanks for listening with us. Learn more at waterpeoplepodcast.com.